From San Francisco, this is Democracy Now!
We're holding the doors of the Global Climate Action Summit and we're blocking them because the solutions that people need to be hearing are actually here on the streets, not behind closed doors, not with people in business attire.
Are you trying to shut this down?
Absolutely.
Indigenous and climate justice activists block the entrance to the opening of the Global Climate Action Summit, demanding California Governor Jerry Brown do more to combat climate change and keep the state's oil in the soil. We'll go to the streets of San Francisco and also hear Governor Brown and Michael Bloomberg's response to the protests.
But I believe California has the most far-reaching plan to deal with emissions as well as oil consumption and production. Our goal is a 45% reduction in oil production as well as consumption.
America's a wonderful country. Here we've got environmentalists protesting an environmental conference. It reminds me of people who want to build a wall along the Mexican border to keep people out from a country that we go to for vacations. Something's crazy here.
We'll look at why environmentalists are protesting an environmental conference by hosting two debates, one on cap and trade and another on geoengineering. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from San Francisco. Heavy rains and 90-mile-per-hour winds are lashing the Carolinas coast as Hurricane Florence makes landfall in North Carolina as a Category 1 storm. The storm's surge has already reached 10 feet, sending chest-high water pouring into residents' homes, forcing first responders to make emergency rescues overnight. Florence has already knocked out power for more than 400,000 people across North and South Carolina. The storm's expected to linger over the region throughout the day today, unleashing up to 40 inches of rain on some coastal communities, threatening to cause deadly flash flooding and toxic waste spills of coal ash and pig manure from the hog farms lining the Carolinas coast. This is North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper.
The worst of the storm is not yet here, but these are the early warnings of the days to come. Surviving this storm will be a test of endurance, teamwork, common sense, and patience.
President Trump has continued to generate widespread criticism for his comments about the federal government's response to Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico last year, which he's called an incredible unsung success. He's now falsely claiming 3,000 people did not die in the wake of the devastating storm. On Thursday, Trump tweeted, 3,000 people did not die in the two hurricanes that hit Puerto Rico. When I left the island after the storm had hit, they had anywhere from 6 to 18 deaths. As time went by, it did not go up by much. Then, a long time later, they started to report really large numbers like 3,000. He went on to tweet, this was done by the Democrats in order to make me look as bad as possible when I was successfully raising billions of dollars to help rebuild Puerto Rico. If a person died for any reason, like old age, just add them onto the list. Bad politics. I love Puerto Rico, Trump tweeted. Puerto Rico's governor formally updated the death toll from the storm to 2,975 people after multiple news outlets and universities demonstrated thousands of people died during the days and weeks after Maria. A Harvard study estimates the death toll might be as high as 4,645 people. On Thursday, San Juan Mayor Carmen Yulín Cruz tweeted, this is what denial following neglect looks like. Mr. Prez, in the real world, people died on your watch. Your lack of respect is appalling, the San Juan mayor tweeted. In the New York primary, Governor Andrew Cuomo defeated insurgent progressive challenger Cynthia Nixon, while incumbent Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul defeated challenger Jumaane Williams. New York City public advocate Letitia James won the Democratic primary for Attorney General. If she wins in November, James will become the first black woman elected to a statewide position in New York. Lawyer Alessandra Biaggi defeated New York State Senator Jeffrey Klein, who led the now-defunct Independent Democratic Conference, a group of Democratic state senators who align themselves with Republicans. And community organizer and Democratic Socialist candidate Julia Salazar won her New York State Senate primary in Brooklyn, unseating 16-year incumbent Martin Dillon. 27-year-old Salazar ran on a platform of affordable housing for all, while her opponent has received more money from real estate developers than nearly any other New York State Senate Democrat. Salazar won despite a number of recent news articles that raised questions about how she described her political affiliations, family wealth, and birthplace. At Columbia University, she was president of Christians United for Israel and an anti-choice group. She now identifies as Jewish and pro-choice. She's also among a dozen women to accuse Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's international spokesman, David Keyes, of sexual assault and harassment. Keyes has announced he's taking a leave of absence. Meanwhile, in New Hampshire's primary Tuesday, a former refugee from Afghanistan named Safia Wazir defeated deeply entrenched incumbent Dick Patton in the Democratic primary for state representative in Concord. Wazir ran on a platform of education equality, affordable housing, and Medicaid expansion. Patton ran on an anti-immigrant platform. She beat him out by winning 329 votes to his 143. The New York Times reports former Trump campaign chair Paul Manafort will soon reach a plea deal with prosecutors to avoid an upcoming trial for his foreign lobbying work in Ukraine. His plea deal could include cooperating with special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into Trump's ties to Russia. Last month, Manafort was convicted in a Virginia court on 8 charges of bank and tax fraud. The Senate Judiciary Committee has delayed its vote on Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh until next week. This comes as California Senator Dianne Feinstein, the highest-ranking Democrat on the Senate Judiciary Committee, has referred information to the FBI involving an accusation of sexual misconduct by Kavanaugh when he was in high school. In Massachusetts, dozens of homes exploded Thursday in Lawrence, Andover, and North Andover, killing a teenager and seriously injuring at least 10 more. The fiery explosions forced residents of the 3 towns north of Boston to flee for their lives. The Andover fire chief said the scene looked like Armageddon. Officials say it's not exactly clear what caused the explosions, but that it could have been caused by an overpressured gas line. Columbia Gas was upgrading the gas lines in the 3 towns when the dozens of homes suddenly went up in flames. In Argentina, thousands of teachers and students walked out of classes Thursday to protest Argentine President Mauricio Macri's crippling austerity policies. This is one of the teachers, Sergio Stapp.
A government that is taking away the opportunity of not just education, but also health, allocating a large part of the budget to security. We see this as a step back.
And a new lawsuit accuses Michigan State University officials of intentionally covering up a 1992 rape committed by Dr. Larry Nassar, who has now been convicted of sexually abusing hundreds of women and girls. The lawsuit alleges Dr. Nassar, who was also the USA gymnastics team doctor, drugged and raped a 17-year-old field hockey player, Erica Davis, at Michigan State University and videotaped the rape. The suit says Michigan State University then stripped Davis of her scholarship after she reported the rape to police and forced Davis's coach, whom she told about the rape, to resign and sign a non-disclosure agreement. The suit argues, quote, Michigan State University could have prevented hundreds of young girls and women from being sexually assaulted by defendant Nassar had they only acted appropriately, decently, and lawfully in 1992. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from San Francisco, the site of the Global Climate Action Summit organized by California Governor Jerry Brown. But the opening of the summit Thursday was disrupted as indigenous and climate justice activists blocked the main entrance to the summit. Democracy Now! Was there in the streets. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Amy Goodman. We're right at the opening of the Global Climate Action Summit. It is Thursday morning, but it's not the normal delegates that are coming through. It is a direct action that's taking place outside. Over 1,000 people, organizers, protesters, sky and water protectors are challenging Governor Brown, the governor of California, who has convened this summit, saying this is Brown's last chance, not only dealing with emissions, but dealing with oil extraction, demanding that he, among other things, ban fracking. Now we see in front of us is a group of people who, well, let's find out who they are.
My name is Angela Andrade, and I'm with the Climate Justice Alliance, and it takes roots. We're holding the doors of the Global Climate Action Summit, and we're blocking them because the solutions that people need to be hearing, the world needs to be hearing, are actually here on the streets. They've always been in the communities and not behind closed doors, not with people in business attire.
Are you trying to shut this down?
Absolutely.
My name's Thomas Joseph. I'm from the Hoopa Valley tribe of Northern California. It's the homeland of my mother. The homeland of my father is the Shoshone Paiute from Owens Valley. My people have lived here for over 10,000 years here in California. And we've seen the destruction that this land and our Mother Earth has received from the governance of this statehood, California. And we know that the leader of this governor of California is not the climate hero that he makes himself out to be. He has destroyed the indigenous lands of California. He's destroyed it with fracking, he's destroyed it with water diversions and with dams. We're here to say enough is enough. We cannot be bought, and if you cannot manage the lands of California properly, then hand them back to the people that can. We've managed these lands for thousands of years. We know how to be in relationship with our Mother Earth.
And talk about how you're connected to each other here.
We're connected right here with some lockdowns, and it says we cannot be bought.
Indigenous Environmental Network, and I come from Minnesota.
And why are you here in front of the Global Climate Action Summit?
We've been mobilizing, building this movement, not only as indigenous peoples, but building a movement north and south of people in struggle, African American, Latino, Asian, poor white folks, labor, our small farmers and peasants. We've been building a movement of real solutions, and that's why we're here. We're denouncing the link with what's going on in there by Jerry Brown, Michael Bloomberg, these corporations, and some of them are the major polluting corporations like Chevron, for an example, pushing a false agenda around privatization of air, privatization of trees, of the soil, called cap and trade, carbon offsets, market systems, carbon tax, carbon pricing. All that is just a distraction. It does not cut emissions at source. So we're here to demand real solutions that protect that sacredness of Mother Earth, protects our communities.
Summit, and we'll see what's happening here.
Police brutality. Get this on film. Get this on film. Police
brutality. Casey Camp Hornick, Ponca Nation of Oklahoma. I'm a councilwoman. So I come on behalf of my people for one reason, because Phillips 66 and the extractive industry, the fracking and injection wells are killing the earth, the water and the air, and that kills us. I'm here as a mother, a companion, a grandmother, a great-grandmother, and a future great-great-great-grandmother. And it is the right of all the silent nations and all of my people to join hands and to honor the natural laws that the Creator put us in. And we're going to change the world. There will be no more oil and gas. We're going to pray it back into the ground where it belongs.
Why are you trying to shut down the entrance to the Global Climate Action Summit?
Because they're full of false solutions here. They're trying to buy and sell the air. And when they buy and sell the air here, it pollutes our people everywhere. They act as if the air stands still and the wind doesn't blow. But this is just a lie that Jerry Brown is telling right now. He's trying to act like he's going to zero emissions, when in fact he is going to up the emissions. He's going to double up on fracking. There's going to be more pollution here, and they're going to be in the same environmental genocidal process that we in the Ponca Nation are enduring right now.
Tell Jerry Brown to keep it in the ground. Tell Jerry Brown to keep it in the ground. Tell Jerry Brown to keep
As the protest took place outside the Global Climate Action Summit, California Governor Jerry Brown and former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg, the UN's special envoy for climate action, held a news conference inside the summit. Governor Brown was asked to respond to the protesters.
Right now, protesters are standing outside calling this a hypocrisy, saying California hasn't done enough to curb drilling in this state. Can we expect any announcements to that effect?
Look, as Mayor Bloomberg says, this is a 10 dimensions where we're looking. There's no one-off here where you just do one thing. There's no one thing. There's many, many things. California, with the leadership of our Air Resources Board under Mary Nichols, has released a scoping plan that covers the whole range of emissions, from oil to transportation, to trucks, to housing, commercial, agriculture, cement, battery storage, you name it, it's there. So my plan is an integrated plan built up over time that is subject to review on a regular basis, and we welcome any suggestions people have. But I believe California has the most far-reaching plan to deal with emissions as well as oil consumption and production. Our goal is a 45% reduction in oil production as well as consumption.
America's a wonderful country. Here we've got environmentalists protesting an environmental conference. It reminds me of people who want to build a wall along the Mexican border to keep people out from a country that we go to for vacations. Something's crazy here.
Soon after the news conference, former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg headed to the main plenary to address the Global Climate Action Summit. He was introduced by House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi.
Please welcome the United Nations Secretary General's Special Envoy for Climate Action, the founder of Bloomberg Philanthropies, and the 108th Mayor of New York City, Michael Bloomberg.
Thank you. Only in America could you have environmentalists protesting an environmental conference.
What's your name and what group are you with?
Cindy Weissner with Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. We're here part of It Takes Roots, telling Bloomberg and all these corporate heads and business leaders that our planet is not for sale, our communities are not for sale, our air and water is not for sale. They cannot commodify the comments.
And what is your name?
My name is Jahan Giron. I'm with the Black Mesa Water Coalition from the Navajo Nation. We're here with all of our friends at It Takes Roots, people who are actually impacted and at the places where they say these so-called wonderful projects are happening. And they're telling us that this is just a lie. This is just a scheme to make money out of the problems that climate change is causing. Right. And we're here with the folks that were on the outside earlier to really challenge that and let people quit patting themselves on the back for something that they're not really doing. They're not protecting the climate. They're not protecting communities. They're not protecting forests. They're not protecting water. And that's what we're here to demand.
Thank you. And what's your name?
Ananda Litan. I'm with the Climate Justice Alliance.
From?
And I'm from the territories of the Tsleil-Waututh and the Musqueam, where Prime Minister Trudeau is planning on buying a $6 billion pipeline. And his friends, elected leaders, governments, and industry are gathering here to put billions and trillions of dollars into bogus technologies like clean coal and nuclear power and mega hydro projects. And they're trading out our future, traditional lands and territories, for a bogus, for perpetuating the problem, entrenching the fossil fuel economy, and really perpetuating the system causing this crisis.
Copy that. Thank you, bud.
Civil society leaders, elected leaders should stand with communities, not corporations, and we're here to let them know they've got to pick a side because the sides are clear.
People should be at the center of the decision.
After the protesters were removed from the hall, former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg began his speech by repeating his comment from the earlier news conference. Only America could you have environmentalists protesting an environmental conference, he said. Well, when we come back, we'll look at one of the more contentious issues within the environmental movement, cap and trade. Stay with us.
For so long, I dreamed a dream where the sweet grass still grows and where the wise ones still know how to dream. For so long, I dreamed a dream where the people spoke their tongue and where the elders still teach the young. I dreamed a dream. To those that dream, I sing this song above and beyond, beyond.
To Those Who Dream by Joanne Shenandoah and A. Paul Ortega. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from San Francisco, where California Governor Jerry Brown's Global Climate Action Summit has officially begun. On Thursday, the opening of the summit was disrupted by protesters who criticized Brown's record as governor in part because of his support for cap and trade. Cap and trade is a market-driven strategy in which governments cap emission levels, then allow companies to buy and sell permits to pollute. California has the most far-reaching cap and trade program in the United States. Last year, Governor Brown signed an extension to the state's cap and trade law, which began under Republican Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger.
We have a cap and trade program. Cap and trade program not designed by me, but designed under the Schwarzenegger, it was started, authorized under the Schwarzenegger administration, and then continued under my own. The cap and trade program is the most efficient, the most elegant to get the job done. I don't think many of you have heard about cap and trade as that has been in effect since 2013. We have not heard much about that. The key thing to remember is we have a cap. There are 400 industries that are under the cap and are part of the cap and trade business. That cap is going down. It is not the same this year as it was last year. We're talking about millions of tons of greenhouse gases that are being outlawed.
California Governor Brown has credited cap and trade with limiting the state's greenhouse gas emissions, but the issue has divided the environmental community. this former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg commenting yesterday about environmentalists protesting an environmental conference. We're joined now by two guests. Peter Miller, Director of the Western Region Climate and Clean Energy Program for the Natural Resources Defense Council, and Ariel Deranger, founder and executive director of the group Indigenous Climate Action, a member of the Athabascan Chippewa First Nation. We welcome you both to Democracy Now!
Thank you.
Ariel, let's begin with you. The massive protest that was outside, stopping delegates from getting inside, or just people, not exactly delegates, from going into the climate summit. Major protest, a disruption of former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg inside, as people were saying climate capitalism is killing my country. And then you have Mayor Bloomberg saying only in America could you have environmentalists protesting an environmental conference. There's this big divide, it seems, between Big Green, as it's called, and climate justice groups. Let's start off there and then get into cap and trade.
Well, I think first off, Bloomberg, that's a misrepresentation. At almost every single COP or UNFCCC international gathering, there have been protests outside those gatherings from the very same people that were outside of the Global Climate Action Summit. So it's not only in America. This is a global issue. So let's just start there. But I think that there are divergences within the movement from the climate justice folks, from the people that are on the front lines of the extractive industries, and from the proposed false solutions around ways to move forward effectively. And that comes from very diverging, I guess, areas of interest, but areas of personal concern. Frontline communities want to see effective change that doesn't just reduce emissions, but effectively addresses their human rights, the rights of their communities, and their ability to have sovereignty and autonomy over their lands, territories, and lives. And a lot of the big greens are more interested in policy and procedure and reduction of emissions. And I think that's where this big divergence, exists. And this is where we have heavy criticism. What's happening within the GCAS is not representative of the climate justice movement from frontline communities.
Peter Miller, if you can talk about that divide. NRDC, your group, is considered one of the big greens, the Natural Resources Defense Council. As you went into the conference, I'm sure you saw the protesters outside. This must not be comfortable for you.
Well, I think there's a lot that unites us as well. We're all at risk from the threat of climate change, all of us on this planet. And it is an existential threat. And we need to be doing as much as we can, as soon as we can, in order to respond to this threat. I welcome the debate and the commitment of partners and colleagues across the world. And the enthusiasm and the commitment of advocates for effective climate action is going to be critical in addressing this threat.
Let's use the example of cap and trade. Talk about why NRDC is for it. First, explain it, and then say why you're advocating for it and support Jerry Brown and his policies in California.
Sure. So what cap and trade does is it's a policy that establishes a declining cap on emissions and then allows the entities, the sources of emissions that are under that cap, to take advantage of the lowest cost ways to reduce emissions in order to meet the overall target. In California, cap and trade is part of a comprehensive suite of policies that have been developed and implemented over the past 10 to 15 years that together compromise the most ambitious climate policy of any state in the country. So in California, we have a cap and trade program that is directed at ambitious targets for 2020. We're going to exceed that target. And now we have a very aggressive target in place for 2030. But it's accompanied by direct emission regulation on a variety of sources, a renewable electricity standard, a low-carbon fuel standard, a variety of policies that help to ensure that we're able to reduce emissions across the economy.
With the climate justice action community, there's a lot of discussion of permit to pollute. Explain how this actually plays out, Ariel.
So first off, we don't disagree with trying to create progressive policies to reduce emissions. I think the climate justice movement absolutely wants to see us move into a direction where we are phasing out of fossil fuel development and putting in policies not just to have great targets, but enforcement of those policies in a real way. The problem with the cap and trade system is that it creates this license to continue to pollute. So in the case of California, you know, we are continuing to see fracking to exist and grow within the state, and that's at the expense of looking at carbon offsets. And these carbon offsets programs exist, like look at the Yurok Nation just signed an agreement. And that takes their land and it puts a new valuation. So they are now looking at commodifying and valuing the carbon sequestration of lands that already existed. They already existed and their carbon sequestration value was always there. No one commodified it before. And suddenly now we're taking it and we're evaluating it and we're allowing it and opening it up for licenses to other corporations to use it as a way to continue to pollute and buy their way out of you know, continued emissions growth in certain sectors.
Let me go to Jerry Brown. This was Governor Brown speaking last year about cap and trade.
Governor Schwarzenegger was pretty amazing. As a Republican in that Democratic legislature, we had Republicans all over the country. Only one signed into law a Global Solutions Act that had this cap and trade measure part of it. This is the only law in the United States. It's the only law that exists. It's right here.
Republican and Democratic governor supporting cap and trade. Can you give more specific examples of how this plays out? We actually were this weekend in Richmond, where the Chevron's largest refinery, its first refinery is. The community there complaining that Chevron can then get a pass on pollution there by trading for carbon credits somewhere else, for example, in the Amazon.
Absolutely. You know, one of the meetings that happened earlier this week was the Governor's Climate and Forest Task Force, where they were talking about looking at protection and conservation of tropical forests of the world as a part of the cap and trade system. So what we're doing is we're allowing communities like Richmond to bear the brunt of the contamination, devastation, health impacts, as well as being housing these growing emissions. And they're offsetting it and sort of becoming carbon neutral by purchasing already existing for millennia carbon sequestration or carbon credits that exist in indigenous territories. Now, what that also does, besides just allow these companies to have license to pollute in Richmond, is that it's also taking the sovereignty and self-determination of the communities in the Amazon rainforest, in places like Ecuador, where these companies now have licenses and leases over their lands and territories, and they start limiting communities' access and traditional use of their lands and territory. It creates more land grabs, and it's just another step of colonization of indigenous lands and territories.
Peter Miller, your response.
Well, I guess the first response is I should clarify that the California cap and trade program currently doesn't allow offsets in outside of North America.
Although other cap and trade programs do, yeah.
That's right. As I said earlier, it's important that cap and trade be part of a comprehensive suite of policies that do address emissions at local sources. Frontline communities are suffering and have suffered from the direct public health impacts of polluting facilities in their neighborhoods, and it's critical that we reduce those emissions in order to protect the public health of those communities. As part of California's suite of policies, we recently passed legislation, AB 617, which imposed accelerated retrofit requirements on refineries and, in fact, on all facilities that are covered by the cap and trade program. So we agree it's critical that those facilities reduce their emissions rapidly.
Ariel, you're sort of shaking your head.
I agree that these policies are good, but it's only when it's become an economic interest to these corporations and to governments that action is being taken. These communities have been calling for reform. They've been calling for reduction of emissions. They've been calling for enforcement of policies for decades. We have bared the brunt of the environmental impacts, and we're bearing the brunt of climate change. And we're talking about progressive solutions that isn't rooted in community, does not give our communities our sovereignty and autonomy, and allows corporations to continue to line their pockets while we still live in marginalized economic deficit zones bearing the consequences of these industries.
Peter Miller.
Well, I agree. And I think it's critical that we take action as soon as possible to address that. NRDC has been active in California trying to reduce pollution and address the threat of climate change since Ronald Reagan was governor in California. And we've worked hard to help address the threat of climate change, as well as public health impacts of pollution across the state, across the country.
Let me go to an action that took place earlier this week here in San Francisco. Hundreds of indigenous and climate activists staged a protest outside a meeting of California Governor Brown's Climate and Forest Task Force. The protesters attempting to deliver a letter, Ariel, you're a part of this, to Brown and task force members. Democracy Now! Was there. Carla, Wills, and Honey Massoud right outside the Park 55 Hotel.
My name is Penny Opal Plant. I live in Richmond, California, just across the bay near the Chevron refinery, where my family has been since the 1930s. I'm one of the founding grandmothers of Idle No More SF Bay, and we're here because of the climate capitalists that are putting forth these plans to make carbon trading a worldwide phenomenon. In this building right here, the Park 55 Hotel, is where the governor's Climate and Forest Task Force is meeting, starting their 3-day meetings today. There are relatives from the Amazon here who have a letter to deliver to the climate capitalists on the inside.
Hi there, my name is Candy White. So we're outside of this particular hotel because this Governor's Forest Climate Task Force meeting is happening with all these big leaders that recently took a tour of the Muir Woods here in California, and they're looking at it with dollar signs in their eyes. How much are these trees worth? How much carbon can we get out of these and sell it as a credit to somebody else so we can continue polluting?
They're going to send 3 people, including the Secretariat of the GCF, within 10 minutes. They want to have we agreed that the talk would happen right here.
Buenos días. Estamos muy dolidos porque estos programas venta de...
We are pained that these programs of forest offsets are being implemented. Whatever their names, Red Plus, offsets, by any name, are being imposed upon us without our free, prior, informed consent. In particular, in the state of Pastaza in Ecuador in the Amazon, the Governor's Climate and Forest Task Force is putting 2.5 million hectares of the Amazon in the carbon market without our consent. We, who are the true owners and guardians of this Amazon, insist that we must read our statement to the Governor of California.
So we would like to invite 4 representatives into the meeting to read the letter. I would like to say thank you for coming to us in a spirit of cooperation and respect. Climate action is difficult. This is one form of climate action that is extremely important. We are also dialoguing upstairs. I am working with a governor from Ecuador. I am working with members of the Yurok tribe. I am working with governments. Governments in Accra. I am working with indigenous leaders in Accra. This is difficult. We are not as far apart as it seems, and we welcome constructive, respectful dialogue.
Special thanks to Democracy Now!'s Carla Wills and Hani Massoud. Our guests are Ariel Daranger and Peter Miller. Ariel Daranger is the founder of the group Indigenous Climate Action in Canada, Alberta, Canada. Peter Miller is with Natural Resources Defense Council. Ariel, you wrote the letter that you were trying to get into this forest meeting.
Yes. So we worked with Seriaku, the Hunikui representatives.
Seriaku of Ecuador.
Seriaku of Ecuador, the Hunikui of Brazil, and representatives from Mexico as well as representatives from Canada to come together and draft this letter. And the reason why is we're seeing governors and so-called climate leaders meeting to talk about commodifying our lands and territories and commodifying what we call as the sacred. These forests and these ecosystems that they're looking to create and demarcate as carbon offsets are our homes. And they're not just our homes. Like, I come from Treaty 8 territory, northern Alberta, Canada, downstream from the tar sands, and I have a vested interest in protecting our forests. And in order to do that, we have to protect the forests of all of our people. And we really wanted to send a clear message to the governors inside that we cannot commodify the sacred. We cannot commodify the sacred and allow our lands and territories to be put into capitalist markets so that they can be traded to allow other corporations to continue to pollute our skies and destroy our communities' rights, sovereignty, territories, and ecological systems that we have relied on for millennia.
Peter Miller, if you could respond, and that banner that the people unfurled as Mayor Bloomberg was about to speak, climate capitalism is killing my community. It's people seeing cap and trade as a part of that.
Well, I think the real threat here is climate change, which does threaten everyone. And we need to be as active as possible, doing whatever we can to reduce the threat of climate change. I welcome active debate on how best to do that. We're clearly not doing nearly enough. And we'll look forward to working with Ariel, our partners, to try and address the urgent threat.
Now, Ariel, you couldn't get into that conference because you were outside protesting and weren't able to get in, but you are going to be addressing the main plenary of GCAS, that's the Global Climate Action Summit today. You'll be on that stage that people protested yesterday, talking about climate change and health.
Yeah. So, you know, this is a big thing. It's not just about challenging these capitalist systems. It's really addressing the fact that climate change is a serious threat for everybody, and we should be addressing it. But the problem is that these structures, these solutions, these false solutions based on capitalism and geoengineering and technology, fails to address the rights of Indigenous communities, which has led to a host of serious health concerns for our communities for centuries. Colonization has created a foundation where our communities are already in disrepair as far as our health, mentally, physically, and spiritually. And now we have extractive industries, and now we have corporations trying to buy our lands and territories and our knowledge systems as a way to, address the climate crisis. We don't want to be a part of these capitalist structures. We never had to be paid to protect our lands and territories, to preserve our culture and identities, and to protect the sacred. And now we're being bullied into being a part of these capitalist markets through cap and trade systems as a way to address the climate. And it does nothing, again, to address these systems of capitalism, colonialism that have put our communities in a state of disrepair for centuries.
Peter Miller.
Well, there's clearly been a long history of exploitation and damage that needs to be addressed and remedied. We do believe that cap and trade, as part of a comprehensive suite of policies, can help us to reduce the threat of climate change.
What do you think, Ariel, could be the major modification of cap and trade, or would you say get rid of it altogether?
I think it's a Ponzi scheme. I mean, I think it's a scam because we're not actually reducing emissions. All we're doing is we're trying to move market trends. We're moving market trends by making companies have to pay another fee in order to continue to pollute. We're not actually reducing emissions because these carbon sequestrations and offsets already exist.
Well, we have a lot to go on this discussion, but we can't do it here. You mentioned geoengineering, and that's our next debate. For our next segment, I want to thank both of you for being here. Peter Miller with Natural Resources Defense Council and Ariel Deranger, who is head and founder of Indigenous Climate Action. This is Democracy Now! We're in San Francisco. Stay with us. Okay. All right. Okay, where's the guest? We have to see him right away. Is that This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from San Francisco, where California Governor Jerry Brown's Global Climate Action Summit has officially begun. We end the show with a look at one of the more controversial solutions to climate change, geoengineering, sometimes called climate manipulation. Geoengineering involves the deliberate altering of the Earth to decrease the level of greenhouse gas emissions. While controlling the Earth's climate system sounds like science fiction, such proposals are already being explored by government agencies, scientists, businesses around the world. Supporters of geoengineering endorse radical ways to manipulate the planet, from spraying aerosols with sulfur particles into the stratosphere to scrubbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. This is environmental activist David Keith explaining the idea.
This geoengineering idea in its simplest form is basically the following. You could put fine particles, say sulfuric acid particles, sulfates, into the upper atmosphere, the stratosphere, where they'd reflect away sunlight and cool the planet. And I know for certain that that will work. Not that there aren't side effects, but I know for certain that will work. And the reason is it's been done. And it was done not by us, not by me, but by nature. Here's Mount Pinatubo in the early 90s that put a whole bunch of sulfur in the stratosphere with a sort of atomic bomb-like cloud. And the result of that was pretty dramatic. After that and some previous volcanoes we have, you see a quite dramatic cooling of the atmosphere.
Critics of geoengineering say these techno-fixes do nothing to address the root causes of climate change, and worse, can be dangerous for the Earth. Well, for more, we're joined by two guests. Gopal Dayaneni is a board member of the Etc. Group, or the ETC Group, a founding member of the Climate Justice Alliance. David Keith is professor of applied physics at Harvard School of Engineering and Applied Sciences and professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, a founder at Carbon Engineering, a company developing technology to capture carbon dioxide. He's the author of the book, A Case for Climate Engineering. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! David Keith, you're joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Can you talk about what geoengineering is and why you see it as a climate solution?
I don't see it as a climate solution. The idea that it's a solution is nutty. The central thing we have to do is bring emissions to zero. If you don't do that, you haven't addressed the root of the problem. It is possible that solar geoengineering, the main thing we work on here, that a combination of emissions cuts and some solar geoengineering might have less climate risks than emissions cuts alone, but I don't think we know that.
So give us some examples.
So solar geoengineering is the idea. Well, geoengineering is a concept that doesn't mean that much, but solar geoengineering is the idea that humans might deliberately alter the reflectivity of the Earth, as indeed we're already doing in lots of ways, but do it more deliberately, as a partial offset to some of the risks of accumulating carbon dioxide. But it's completely true that it doesn't deal with the problem of emissions, and we have to solve that. It's also true that even if we cut emissions to zero, even if we eliminate emissions, we actually don't solve the climate problem, because the CO2 that we've put in there through industrial action, polluters over centuries, stays in the air for millennia. So there, in fact, are no magic bullet simple solutions to climate change. It's completely incorrect to say that solar geoengineering is a solution, but it's also incorrect to say that bringing emissions to zero is a solution, because we'll still have the climate change.
Gopal Dayaneni, talk about geoengineering and your concerns with it.
I find it interesting that we're starting off by saying geoengineering doesn't mean much of anything, when in fact billions of dollars are being invested in it. It's been mentioned in the IPCC reports as a potential solution or intervention. I think it's pretty easy to understand what geoengineering is. It's the intentional disruption of Earth's systems, either in the biosphere, the oceans, or the atmosphere, in order to supposedly, in this case, mitigate climate to some degree. The real issue here isn't about whether it works or whether it doesn't work or whether we need it or it's actually about what it represents as a social process in the moment that we're in trying to address the root causes of climate change. Every single guest you've had on the show so far today who comes from social movements, from Ariel, who mentioned geoengineering at the end of her piece, to all of the folks who were part of the action yesterday, all recognize that this kind of investment research is a signal to the world that these kinds of techno fixes are part of how we're going to address climate change. And it doesn't get at what are the root causes, which are we have to reduce emissions at the source. We need to restore control and democracy and sovereignty to communities. We need to respect the rights of indigenous peoples and the rights of Mother Earth. We need to actually address reparations for the climate damage that's been done to this point, both in the global south. And we need to actually transition not from corporate solutions that are based in the same petrochemical industry that got us here, but to energy democracy solutions where communities have control over the decisions that affect their
Professor
energy future.
Keith, your response.
I'm not aware of any single investment that is a corporate investment in solar geoengineering of any significance. That billion-dollar figure is made up from whole cloth. It's just false. And that's not uncommon. ETC often makes up numbers because it's effective to do, but it isn't true. And it is absolutely true that we have to bring emissions to zero, and that involves fighting corporate interests. Totally true. Most of the people actually working on solar geoengineering research, in fact, are environmental scientists with long track records of opposing fossil fuels. And so the idea this is some kind of corporate thing is just, it's convenient, it's effective, but it isn't true. And most importantly, this gentleman failed to address the fact that even when you bring emissions to zero, you still have the CO2 in the atmosphere. And yes, I'd like to see more democracy. I'd love to see a reform of democracy, and we should, but that won't magically remove the CO2 from the atmosphere.
Actually, what's interesting is, I mean, we had Ariel on just a moment ago, but Carbon Engineering, the company that David Keith started, is financed by somebody who many of the listeners and viewers of Democracy Now! Will know, Murray Edwards, who is a tar sands tycoon. This is actually part of the same fossil fuel petrochemical industry suite of interventions that are constantly being proposed. And to separate solar radiation management from carbon sequestration and storage is what David would like to do, because he'd like to say, oh, we're just doing these small experiments in Arizona to test out whether solar radiation management has a potential future. But the reality is that what we're doing is when those balloons go up to test his solar radiation management theories, it is doing more. It is sending a signal that we are going to need to engage in these high-cost, high-energy corporate techno solutions. The Carbon Engineering, the company that he started, it is explicitly states that this is about intellectual property. That's their market value. This is not actually about communities having control over the resources required to actually address not just the mitigation and not just the reducing of emissions, but also to have control over their own resilience in the face of coming climate
Professor
change.
Keith, can you explain the solar radiation experiment in Arizona?
Well, no, I want to address those comments directly. So Carbon Engineering is a company. So yes, it cares about intellectual property, actually with investment and very close connection to the Squamish tribe and to the local community at Squamish, in the Squamish Nation. Carbon Engineering is trying to make carbon neutral fuels for transportation as a way to decarbonize, say, shipping or airplane travel. And that only works with very strong regulations on carbon emissions. And it only works essentially if the oil companies lose. So yes, it's true that we had some early investment from Murray Edwards, who absolutely is an oil tycoon, although in fact, as oil tycoons, relatively liberal. But the point is, Carbon Engineering's corporate interests, which it definitely has, are in having strong climate policy, because we only would make any money if there was very, very strong constraints. But also, Carbon Engineering is not actually doing carbon sequestration. Carbon Engineering is doing low carbon transportation fuels, and that may or may not be a good idea, but it's basically one of the many ways we might cut emissions. And I can't see any I can see that it's very similar to, say, electric vehicles or hydrogen fuels or biofuels, all of which have some problems, all of which have some advantages, but I don't see why it's very tightly linked to solar geoengineering, which is not particularly high energy or high money, has very high risks and uncertainties. These are pretty different things, and it happens to be convenient to mix it up, but I'm not hearing reasoned arguments why they're connected.
Well, first of all, this is very much connects to the cap and trade conversation that we had earlier and the offsets conversation. The carbon engineering, this idea, and David has written about this extensively, both carbon sequestration and also this bioenergy to carbon capture. These are all based on the assumption that we're going to continue to commoditize the atmosphere, that we're going to continue to put a price on carbon, that we're going to continue to trade and have offsets and all of these things. And that is fundamentally the problem. At the foundation of the difference here is whether we understand this crisis as a crisis of social inequality and ecological erosion and the erosion of democracy, or whether we understand this crisis simply as about the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere. And for all the time and resources and energy that we spend actually focusing on these fantastical, magical thinking, as Naomi talks about in This Changes Everything, we are not spending our time dealing with the root causes of the crisis, which is what every other guest on your program today from our social movements has been talking about. And I think that's really the thing here. It's like we could be spending our time and energy actually talking about and focusing on the root causes of the crisis, as opposed to engaging in these deadly distractions about these fantastical ideas that we are going to do large-scale environmental modification of the planet. And we can talk about these as small little experiments. What they are is they represent a mind shift. There is the struggle for climate and climate justice is actually about whether we are going to attack social inequity, environmental destruction, and ecological erosion, or whether we're going to continue business as usual and just pretend that there are other ways out of this. And quite frankly, I think urgency should not enable desperation. And I think it's easy to say, well, this is just one of many. This is a suite of solutions. We need everything. That's the same thing as all of the above. That is the story of we need gas as a bridging fuel.
Professor Keith.
I'm actually not saying that, and I've never said that. So absolutely true that there's a crisis of democracy. Part of the reason we citizens haven't been able to get the kind of climate action we need is failures in our democracy that put too much power associated with fossil fuels that have blocked action. I couldn't agree more. And I've taken personal risks up to coming close to losing my job at University of Calgary when I called out oil companies for corruption at that university. So I've worked, in fact, on cutting emissions and opposing fossil fuels for decades. So the idea that somehow it's this dichotomy between it's all about democracy and we just need to focus on that and we should just do business as usual, make capitalism happy, that's just fuzzy thinking. So yes, there's a challenge in democracy. It's central. If we can't get broad collective agreement control from the people that allows us to force emissions cuts, we won't solve the problem. That's true. It's also true that we have to make decisions. Go ahead.
We just have 5 seconds. David Keith, I hope we can do part 2 of this discussion. It's clearly an important one, but we can't do it right here. David Keith of Harvard University, Gopal Dayaneni of ETC Group and Climate Justice Alliance. That does it for a week here in San Francisco. Special thanks to our crew here, Neil Tanner, Conrad Slater, Jack Morris, Alan Filippi, Norbert Lee, Farah Munawar, John Jordan, and Felicia Cuarta. Democracy Now! I want to thank the team here, Ariel Boone and Libby Rainey and Mike Burke and Dennis Moynihan and John Hamilton and Hani Massoud and Carla Wills. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.